Hi folks, welcome back. Last time we talked about the definition of a plant, we talked about various features of all plants, and various features of land plants. We ended with a discussion of life cycles and the fact of alternation of generations. Alternation of generations is this weird feature in all land plants where both the haploid phase and the diploid phase are multicellular. What you're going to see today is that this is true of all groups, and we're going to look in particular at 4 groups. Today we'll talk about 3 of them, and these are the mosses, the ferns, and the conifers. But we'll start with a continuation of our discussion of life cycles and alternation of generations. So here we go. You'll remember that all land plants share a number of features, and here they are once again. And the last one is this feature called alternation of generations. And it is, as you'll recall from last time, when a sexual organism has both multicellular haploid and diploid stages in its life cycle. And as I've said now several times, this is true of all land plants. Alternation of generations arose independently in evolution several or perhaps many times, and it's also in other groups, including some charophytes and some red algae, and even other groups. The alternating generations are the gametophyte, which is the haploid phase, and the sporophyte, which is the diploid phase. And you'll recall that gametophytes make gametes and sporophytes make spores. So if we were in class today, if we were having lecture together in person, we would draw this together. I would draw this on a projector for you, and you would perhaps have something that would allow you to draw it along with me. So let's draw this. First of all, let's draw an animal life cycle. Animal life cycles are simple. In any sexual process, there is meiosis and there's fertilization. These are the 2 events that define a sexual life cycle. In animals, meiosis produces gametes. And this happens from a mature individual. You might call that an adult. So meiosis makes gametes. The 2 kinds of gametes are egg and sperm. So meiosis directly makes these. The egg and the sperm combine, the nuclei unite to restore the diploid stage in the process of fertilization. Fertilization gives rise to the next generation, starting out with an embryo, which is followed by an adult. So the first step really is zygote, then embryo, then adult, but it's all the diploid phase. So we can draw a line across here. Let's do that. And this will divide the haploid and diploid stages of the animal life cycle. And on the top we have 1N for one set of chromosomes, N meaning number of chromosomes. So this is the haploid stage. And on the bottom, below this dotted line, we have the 2N stage, or the diploid stage. So 2N is 2 times the haploid number of chromosomes. So that's the animal life cycle. That's very straightforward, very familiar to all of us. Okay, so let's draw a land plant life cycle. We start with our division, meiosis, and fertilization. The major message here is that in all land plants, meiosis produces spores. Each spore is a single cell. It is the product of meiosis. Spores produce gametophytes. The gametophyte is a haploid, multicellular structure. Its business is to make egg and sperm. The egg and sperm unite in the process of fertilization, so the nuclei come together, and this restores the diploid state. And this is the sporophyte. So fertilization produces the sporophyte. So we have our 2 stages, gametophyte and sporophyte. We can draw our dotted line across this diagram to differentiate the haploid from the diploid parts of the life cycle. So let's do that. Everything above this line is haploid, 1N, one set of haploid chromosomes, and everything below the dotted line is diploid, or 2N, two sets of haploid chromosomes. This is alternation of generations. We have a multicellular haploid, the gametophyte, and we have a multicellular diploid, the sporophyte. Now you should figure out a jingle, a song, something that will help you remember that in all land plants, meiosis makes spores. So how do spores make gametophytes? And how do gametophytes make egg and sperm? Well, there's only one possible way this could happen. That's by mitosis. These structures are already haploid, so this is by mitosis. Spores make gametophytes by mitosis. Gametophytes make sperm and egg by mitosis. And that's it. That's true of all land plants, without exception. So we've used these words gametophyte, sporophyte, spore, gamete. What are spores and gametes? Well, each one of them is a single cell, but a spore is a single cell that can divide to produce a multicellular organism. That spore often has a protective coat. A gamete, on the other hand, must unite with another cell before it can further development. So a gamete is a single cell that can unite with another gamete to produce a diploid zygote. So this is the difference between spores and gametes. Each one of these is a single cell. You'll remember from the end of last lecture, we talked about Chlamydomonas. Chlamydomonas is a single-celled green alga, a member of the Chlorophyta, and it spends most of its life as a single cell, a single haploid cell. And you might remember this diagram from your text, from your reading, and from the lecture last time. Here we have asexual reproduction, where the Chlamydomonas just divides by mitosis and makes more copies of itself. At some point, it might undergo sexual reproduction, in which case a single cell is called a gamete. So this single cell can unite with another cell, and Chlamydomonas happens to have separate mating types, plus and minus. So here you can see the process of fertilization. And fertilization results, of course, in a zygote. So this zygote doesn't do anything further in terms of development. It is a single cell. Sure, it has a protective coat, but it doesn't do anything further in development. Instead, it undergoes meiosis. So it produces 4 offspring. That's what meiosis does. A single cell makes 4 new cells. And in this case, it makes 2 plus mating types and 2 minus mating types. That's Chlamydomonas. This is not alternation of generations. This is not a land plant. There is no multicellular diploid phase. There might be, if you want to stretch it, a multicellular haploid phase, just when those cells come together in this grouping before they split up again and divide. So we talked about at the end of last time how alternation of generations arose in all of these separate organisms that have it. And you can see here that a zygote that's formed can be retained on the mother tissue, the mother gametophyte tissue, the haploid tissue. And if it's retained there, and instead of undergoing meiosis, it undergoes development by dividing and dividing and dividing and getting bigger and bigger, then you have alternation of generations, because you have a multicellular haploid that's holding the egg that gives rise to this multicellular diploid now that has stayed on mom and has developed. So this is how land plants and any other organisms that have alternation of generations have invented this trait. So now you've seen this a couple of times. I hope it's a little clearer than it was before. So those are the 2 stages, haploid and diploid. Sporophyte, diploid, gametophyte, haploid. And you'll recall from last time that land plants have male and female sex organs. So the female sex organ, the organ that produces the egg by mitosis, is called the archegonium. And here you can see it labeled on the left. Okay, great. So, land plants. If you're walking around outdoors and you see plants, you should be able to tell what big group it falls into. Is it a land plant? Is it not a land plant? And within the land plants, what sort of land plant is it? In land plants, there are 10 big groups, and these are called phyla. They're called divisions. In the world of plants, a phylum and a division are the same thing. So 10 big groups. For us, we're only going to be concerned with 4 of them. These are the mosses, the ferns, the conifers, and the flowering plants, or angiosperms. And today we're going to talk about the first 3 of these. Our first group is the mosses. This is the division Bryophyta. So you should know these division terms. We're only learning 4, so learn the division terms. Bryophytes are the mosses. The mosses live in wet areas that are wet at least part of the year. There are about 15,000 species of moss. They're all low growing. They never grow more than a few centimeters tall. They're confined to damp areas, that is, areas that are damp usually the whole year round, but in some special cases, damp for most of the year. This is for 2 reasons. The first is that they have swimming sperm. The sperm of mosses have to swim to get to the egg, so they need water. Secondly, mosses have no true vascular tissue. They instead have a very rudimentary vascular system. So they cannot grow tall, they cannot grow big. They have to have all of their cells near the external part of the environment to stay moist. Because they don't have a vascular system, they have no true leaves. They have no true roots. Leaves and roots only come with true vascular plants, true vascular systems. They have the gametophyte dominant. What this means is that the gametophyte stage is the stage that you tend to see. It's the long-lived stage, it's the bigger stage. The sporophyte stage is smaller and shorter-lived. So gametophyte dominant. Finally, they are homosporous, and we're going to see what that means in a little while, but for now, just record that they are homosporous or homosporous. That means they make only 1 spore size. Here's a moss. These are gametophytes. Gametophyte, 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 and you're looking down at the top of these gametophytes, and these are haploid individuals. If you look closely in a moss population, you will sometimes see these little structures sticking out of the top. That's the other life stage. This is the sporophyte. And you can see now moss gametophytes giving rise to sporophytes that stick out of them. And this shows you one of the features of mosses, and that is that the sporophytes are dependent on the gametophytes. The gametophyte is dominant, the sporophyte is short-lived and lives off the gametophyte. So let's look at a moss life cycle. Here it is. Where do you start? Well, let's start with the spore. So you can see spores at about 9 o'clock on this diagram. And in this case, the spore is going to develop into either a male gametophyte or a female gametophyte. Some mosses have both male and female structures on the same individual gametophyte, but most have it this way. So there's a male gametophyte and a female gametophyte. The spore divides by mitosis, making a gametophyte. So let's first look at the male at the top. The male gametophyte has, as you recall, sex organs called antheridia. And these are born at the very top of the plant. And you can see them here shown in brown. And the brown indicates the sperm inside that are produced by the thousands within each antheridium. Meanwhile, a female gametophyte is produced. And you can see that one has archegonia at the top, and each archegonium has a single egg. If a raindrop or a little bit of water comes along, splashes into the male gametophyte, onto the male gametophyte, and hits the antheridia, then the sperm can be released and travel with that raindrop or with that little rivulet of water, and maybe encounter an archegonium, maybe encounter an egg. And if it does, then it can swim down the neck of that archegonium and fertilize the egg. Once fertilization occurs, then the new product is the zygote. So we have our new sporophyte right away, and that's indicated by the brownish lines in this diagram from your textbook. So you can see the archegonium with its new zygote. There's an embryo, which is what the zygote turns into, and the embryo then becomes a young sporophyte. Of course, the zygote, the embryo, and the young sporophyte are all sporophyte tissue. These, you can see now, remain on the top of the gametophyte. These sporophytes grow and grow and grow. They have a stalk and they have a capsule at the top. And this capsule is very important. It's the structure that's going to make more spores. Spores are produced in land plants by meiosis. So the sporangium in this case is the site of meiosis. This diploid structure, the sporophyte, a whole generation, lives on the gametophyte, lives off of the gametophyte, is completely dependent on the gametophyte for all its nourishment, and it has this special structure, this sac, called a sporangium. Sporangium means spore vessel. Angio means vessel, so it's a vessel that contains spores, and that's where meiosis occurs. So once meiosis has occurred, the spores are dispersed, and the life cycle continues. So that's a moss life cycle. You can see that everything above these lines is 1N or haploid, and everything below is 2N or diploid. Here are some moss gametophytes viewed from the top. Here are some moss sporophytes growing out of the gametophytes. The sporophytes will wither away after they've released their spores. Here is a close-up of moss antheridia on a gametophyte. Each antheridium has thousands of sperm cells. Here are moss archegonia on the top of a gametophyte, and on the left you can see 2 archegonia, and on the right you can see a single archegonium with a single egg. And the sperm would have to swim down that neck to get to the egg. More moss sporophytes showing the sporangia. The next great step in evolution is the invention of vascular tissue, and that's what we'll talk about next. Welcome back. We've been talking about mosses and how they are confined to damp areas. They're also very short. They don't get more than a few centimeters tall. That's because they don't have true vascular tissue. Vascular tissue provides support. It also supplies nutrients and water around the plant. It allows the plant to have sort of a circulatory system and move materials around. But it's essential for support as well. Vascular tissue is the next great invention in the evolution of land plants. And you can see here in our cladogram, our diagram, that we have our non-vascular plants. Those include the mosses and some other groups that we're not talking about, liverworts and hornworts. And after that, vascular tissue was invented. And you can see that all plants after that are vascular plants. So everything we're going to talk about from now on is a vascular plant. Vascular plants first appeared in the fossil record about 410 million years ago. And here you can see a plant called Cooksonia, and there's the fossil on the left, and on the right is an artist reconstruction of the fossil, and this looks like a plant with vascular tissue and sporangia at the top. Our first group of vascular plants is the Pterophyta. The Pterophyta are the ferns and the horsetails and their allies, and Pterophyta means winged plant. Ptero means wing or feather, and phyta means plant. So this is a fern. Ferns have about 20,000 species. Most of them are tropical. They appeared in the fossil record about 400 million years ago. They do have true vascular tissue. That's xylem and phloem, and we'll talk at length about xylem and phloem in another lecture. So that vascular tissue, as you know, provides support and supply to the plant. Like mosses, ferns have swimming sperm. Unlike mosses, ferns have a dominant sporophyte. So this is in contrast to mosses. Here, the sporophyte is the dominant, the long-lived, the big part of the life cycle. Furthermore, ferns can either make one size of spore, that's homospore, or they can make 2 sizes of spore, that's heterospore, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. So here's a fern life cycle. Let's start at the spore. So you know the spore in land plants is made by meiosis. So we have a spore, and that pops out of its casing, its sporopollenin-covered casing, and develops by mitosis into a young gametophyte. That young gametophyte grows into a heart-shaped structure that is a few millimeters in diameter, perhaps up to the size of a dime, and is about 1 cell thick. So it's a very flimsy little structure, and it sits on the ground in a moist area. And many fern gametophytes make both male and female sex organs. So the one shown here makes both, and you can see that there are Antheridia and Archegonia. So the Antheridia make sperm, and the Archegonia make eggs, 1 egg for each Archegonium. And as you know, these sperm have to travel by water. So once again, a raindrop or a little bit of water hits the gametophyte and causes sperm to transfer over to the Archegonium of the same gametophyte or a different gametophyte. And this results in fertilization. Once fertilization occurs, of course, a zygote is formed, and that zygote is the new sporophyte. It develops inside the Archegonium for a bit. It stays on the gametophyte for a bit, and then, here's something new, and then the gametophyte withers away as the sporophyte takes over. So you can see at the bottom of the diagram, the new sporophyte is growing, and the gametophyte will wither away. That gametophyte, by the way, has little extensions underneath it. Those are not true roots. They're just extensions to help it stay anchored. The sporophyte keeps growing, and as we move along the diagram here, you can see that the fern starts to take the typical fern shape, the typical fern morphology. So they look like feathered leaves, feathery leaves. And the mature sporophyte looks like that. Now, what's the business of a sporophyte? The business of a sporophyte in land plants is to make spores, and that's achieved by meiosis. So in this case, you can see that there are special structures underneath the leaves called sporangia. And a sporangium, as you know, is a structure that houses cells that will undergo meiosis and make spores. So this sporangium has spores inside it that are the result of meiosis, and then they're released, shown here at about 10 or 11 o'clock on the diagram, and the cycle continues. We can divide our life cycle into the haploid and diploid stages. So the haploid is above this blue line, and the diploid is below. This fern is homosporous. That is to say, it makes a single spore size, and that single spore size makes a gametophyte that makes both sperm and egg. In ferns, the sporangia are often grouped into sori, and the singular of that is sorus. So here's a sorus that's made up of a bunch of sporangia. Here's a single sporangium, and some ferns have this interesting morphology of sporangium where it's sort of like a vacuum cleaner hose wrapped around a blob, and inside the blob are spores that are made by meiosis. And what happens is this thing snaps back and then opens up and then snaps forward and throws the spores out into the environment. And here's a picture of that happening. So this vacuum cleaner hose has opened up, snapped back, and snapped forward. It's a very fast motion. Here's a movie. And you can see here, this is not my movie. You can see, there, look at that. It just shot. Rearing back, shooting spores, releasing spores. Shooting back, releasing spores. Releasing spores. And look at that. Those spores are thrown literally millimeters from the actual sporangium. So it's funny they go through all that effort to throw them just a short distance, but it must pay off. Here's a fern that's common in Nova Scotia. This is cinnamon fern. And it actually has two kinds of leaves. It has a vegetative leaf and it has a reproductive leaf. And it's the reproductive leaves that hold the sporangia. And in fact, they look very different from the vegetative leaves. And you can see a group of sporangia here in a picture I took from one of these ferns here in Nova Scotia. And they don't have this vacuum cleaner hose rearing back method of dispersing their spores. They have this clamshell method. So they open up like a clamshell and then close the clamshell partly really fast to throw the spores. So here's a picture I took in my lab of a sporangium with spores on the left, and those green little dots, those green little blobs, are spores inside the sporangium, and on the right is the sporangium after release. And here's a movie I took at 400 frames per second, so at fast motion, and it's played back at 13 times slowed down, so this is slow motion, just so you can get a sense of how fast this is. So just watch this. If you see any vibration, that's because the Life Sciences Center vibrates. It actually shakes. The floors move. Okay, we're watching for a sporangium to open and then close. There! It happened. Right there. The spores were released. Let's see if there's another one. This is perhaps the fastest motion in all of plants, the release of spores by ferns. So that's that. That's cinnamon fern releasing its spores. Each spore will go on to make a gametophyte if it lands in a nice moist environment. And here are a couple of fern gametophytes. You may never have seen one. You'd have to look carefully. You'd have to be down near the ground, perhaps on your hands and knees, looking really, really carefully for them. A gametophyte, of course, produces an egg or a sperm, or perhaps both. And if it makes an egg and that egg is fertilized, then a sporophyte grows out of it. And that's what you can see here. You see the sporophyte growing out of the gametophyte, and the gametophyte will wither away, and the sporophyte will then live probably for potentially many, many years. So I mentioned that most ferns are homosporous. Some are heterosporous. So homospory refers to the production of one spore size during meiosis, and heterospory refers to the production of two spore sizes from meiosis. So this is how it would work, and this is from your text. So a sporangium on a sporophyll, that just means a leaf that has a sporangium on it. If it makes a single type of spore, a single size, then that spore typically develops into a bisexual gametophyte. That means it has both archegonia and antheridia on it. And then this gametophyte makes eggs and sperm. So this is all mosses and most ferns. Some ferns, however, have heterosporous production, so that there are two kinds of sporangia. There's a sporangium that makes big spores, and so it's called a megasporangium. And that big spore is called a megaspore, and that turns into a female gametophyte. That female gametophyte makes eggs by mitosis. On the other hand, there is a microsporangium, and that makes a microspore by meiosis. So the microspore, of course, grows into a male gametophyte, and that male gametophyte's business is to make sperm by mitosis. So meiosis makes the spores, and then mitosis makes the gametes. Heterosporous spore production occurs in some ferns and in all seed plants, which is what we're going to talk about in a little bit. So if vascular tissue was the great invention about 400 million years ago, then the next great invention in land plants was the invention of the seed and pollen. And this gave rise to the seed plants. The seed plants are represented by taxa like conifers, flowering plants, cycads, etc. And every seed plant has pollen. So pollen and seeds come together. Pollen and seeds occur together. There are 5 divisions, 5 phyla of seed plant. Cycads were dominant during the Jurassic. They were very common during the period when the dinosaurs roamed the earth. And there are some in the Life Sciences Center and some of the floors. If you go to the ends of the hallways, you can find a cycad. A ginkgo is a tree. Now there's only one species that remains, but it's its own phylum, Ginkgophyta. And ginkgo trees are famous for being really nice city trees. They also have the strange feature of coming in male and female individuals, and the female individuals make these cones, technically. They look like fruits, but they're technically cones, and the cones contain this material that smells very much like dog excrement. And so city planners have to be careful not to plant too many female trees around, because it leaves material on sidewalks that people don't appreciate. One of the strangest groups of seed plants is called the Gnetophytes, and you can see those represented down in the lower left. Gnetophytes have confounded botanists for many years. And one of the strangest plants is in the middle there, the lower middle. It's called Welwitschia. This is a plant that has a long taproot. It grows in the deserts of Western Africa. And it has leaves that just keep growing and growing and growing. It only has 2 leaves that grow out along the ground and become tattered. And it's just a very weird plant adapted to a very harsh environment. But the two groups that we're going to talk about are the conifers and the flowering plants. The conifers are the phylum Coniferophyta, and the flowering plants are the phylum Anthophyta. As I mentioned, seed plants have both seeds and pollen. What's a seed? A seed is an embryo plus nutrition for that embryo plus a protective coat. So you can think of a seed as Junior with a bag lunch and a coat. A seed develops from a brand new structure called an ovule. This new structure appears in the seed plants. The ovule is the site of meiosis, the site of female meiosis, that is. It therefore contains the female gametophyte. It contains the female sex organs, that is archegonia. It contains the egg, and if fertilized, it will contain the embryo, and that's the new sporophyte. So that's what a seed is. Let's look at it more closely. Here's an ovule in a conifer at an early stage just before meiosis. And as you know, this meiosis will occur in the megasporangium because this is meiosis on the female side of things. So this is a conifer ovule, and the dark brown indicates an integument. That's the outermost material, and that's from the mother plant. That's from the parent plant. So that integument is diploid. And there's an opening at the top called a micropyle, which we'll get to later, where the pollen will come in. And inside this integument is a megasporangium. And here, this megasporangium is going to make a gametophyte. It's going to first make a spore, and then it will make a gametophyte. So what's a megasporangium do? It undergoes meiosis. So if there's a diploid cell in that megasporangium that's going to undergo meiosis, it's going to make 4 products, right? Right. Well, typically 3 of them die, and there's only 1 remaining. So what you have is the 1 remaining product that is a spore. And because it's a female spore, it's a megaspore. So there's a single functional megaspore, which is haploid. This will divide and divide and divide and divide and divide, becoming thousands of cells big, and it will become the megagametophyte. So let's look at this a little more closely. We can flip the ovule upside down, and here now from one of the editions of your textbook, you can see here an ovule of a conifer. So on the left we have an immature unfertilized ovule. You can see an integument, you can see a megaspore, and you can see a megasporangium that made the megaspore. Moving toward the middle picture, you can see that the megaspore has now developed into a female gametophyte. That's another term for megagametophyte. Female gametophyte, megagametophyte, same thing. That female gametophyte is going to produce an egg. There's the egg in the center. At some point, this ovule might have a pollen grain land on it. That's the act of pollination. And that pollen grain will then grow a tube into the female tissue and release a sperm cell. That sperm cell will unite with the egg, fertilization will occur, and now we have an embryo, which is shown on the right. So on the right, you have an embryo growing inside the female gametophyte, which is inside the integument, which is now a seed coat. So the far right represents a mature seed, and the mature seed consists of 3 parts: the seed coat, the embryo itself, and the food supply, which is the megagametophyte in the case of conifers. So to summarize, seed plants have both seeds and pollen. A seed is a three-part structure, a mature seed that is. It's embryo plus nutrition plus a seed coat. And seeds are mature fertilized ovules. Pollen is the mature male gametophyte. Pollen is only a few cells big. So compare this to mosses, where a gametophyte was thousands of cells big. Now we have a gametophyte, a male gametophyte in this case, that's only a few cells big, and it makes a sperm cell. And here are some pictures of pollen grains. So, our first group is the division Coniferophyta, the conifers. Coniferophyta means cone-bearing. Fer, F-E-R, means bearing, as in carrying, like Lucifer means light-bearing. And you can see here some mature female cones, typical of conifers. The conifers contain about 550 species. Their reproductive organs are in cones. They have a dominant sporophyte. They are heterosporous. All seed plants have a dominant sporophyte. All seed plants are heterosporous. All seed plants have the microgametophyte as the pollen. And the megagametophyte is within an ovule, and that megagametophyte makes the egg. In conifers, that megagametophyte nourishes the embryo. That's just in conifers. It nourishes the embryo. Here's an example of a conifer. This is white pine, eastern white pine, and you know this from as a very common tree in Canada. It's a very instantly recognizable plant with these long branches that sort of sweep upward at the ends, and each little bundle of needles has 5 needles. This is larch or tamarack, and you can see on the left some cones, and on the right in November these trees turn yellow, and they actually lose their leaves. They are deciduous. That is to say, they lose their leaves in the winter. So not all conifers are evergreen. Some are deciduous. Here's the bald cypress from the swamps of Georgia and Florida. And you can see here how they grow in standing water, and they have these sort of buttresses at the bottom, these swollen bases, very typical of cypresses. And these too are deciduous, but these are conifers. So let's look at a conifer life cycle. Here we go. Where do we start? Well, let's start with the big obvious part about the mature sporophyte. Here's a pine tree, and you can see that the pine tree has made cones, so that's where conifer gets its name. Now, in the case of conifers, the cones are always separately male and female. There's no such thing as a cone that's both male and female. So the ovulate cone makes ovules, that's the female cone, and the pollen cone makes pollen, that's the male cone. So let's look at the male cone first. So the pollen cone has many sporangia on it, and each sporangium contains many cells that will undergo meiosis. And those cells are called microsporocytes. They're diploid. They undergo meiosis. Each one produces 4 pollen grains. Those are released into the air. All conifers have wind pollination. Their pollen is moved by the wind. It's not carried by animals. It's not carried by bats or beetles or bees or birds. It's just released into the wind. On the female side, we have an ovulate cone, and the ovulate cone's business is to make ovules. So each scale of an ovulate cone produces 1 or 2 ovules, and each ovule will make an egg. So the ovule, of course, contains the cell that will undergo meiosis, so that's a megasporocyte, or a megaspore mother cell, same thing. And that megasporocyte undergoes meiosis inside the megasporangium, and that produces the spore, the female megaspore. And you can see that after meiosis, there's the single surviving megaspore. And in the archegonium, a female gametophyte is produced in the typical fashion, and then you can see fertilization is occurring. Now, one thing you might notice in this diagram is up around 2 o'clock, there are pollen grains that are arriving. That's pollination. Pollination is the arrival of pollen near the female tissue. It's only later on in time that fertilization occurs. So that pollen sits there for quite some time, and then later on actually fertilizes the egg, and that's shown down around 5 or 6 o'clock. So fertilization occurs, and then after that, there's an embryo developing inside the ovule, and once the ovule is mature, we have a seed. So in this particular species, there are 2 ovules on a cone scale, on a female cone scale, and you can see that they have made the 2 seeds. Each seed then can grow into a new conifer tree or shrub. So that's the life cycle of a conifer. And we said this before, but I want to emphasize that the nutrition in a conifer seed comes from the megagametophyte. So Junior is nourished by the megagametophyte. The megagametophyte, of course, makes an egg inside the archegonium. It nourishes the embryo, as we just said. One really cool thing about seeds is the fact that they contain multiple generations. In fact, they contain 3 generations. In the case of conifers here, you can see the seed coat, which is the mother generation. That's part of the parental generation. And inside the mature seed is a megagametophyte, which is nourishing the embryo. The megagametophyte is a haploid generation, so it's the haploid generation following the parental diploid generation. And then the new sporophyte is the embryo, which is exactly 1 sporophyte generation later than the seed coat generation. So there are 3 generations in a seed. And of course, the microgametophyte is the pollen grain, and that makes sperm. And it's only a few cells big, maybe 3 cells. Here's a diagram that I thought could perhaps be helpful. So this is your standard land plant life cycle with heterospory, so microspore, megaspore. Where are all these structures that we've been talking about? Where are all these things like pollen, ovules, etc.? Well, here they are. You can just overlay them on the different parts of the life cycle. So pollen is the microgametophyte. So it comes from the microspore and it makes sperm. The ovule is the female side of reproduction, and it is a structure that contains the megaspore, which becomes a megagametophyte, etc., etc. So you know what conifers look like. But perhaps you haven't appreciated what the male cones look like. Here are some male cones of the eastern white pine, and they're releasing pollen, and they do that in abundance in late May and early June in this part of the world. If you took a longitudinal section through this early cone, you could see that each cone scale has a sporangium and makes many, many pollen grains. Female cones, same species, eastern white pine. This is late May, so these are very young, newly emerging female cones. You might not think of them as cones. They don't look like your standard pine cones. They're not woody yet. That won't happen for another year or 2. But these pine cones are very young, and if you took a longitudinal section through them, you would see this. You would see each cone scale has 2 ovules on it. 1 year later, these cones will be pollinated and they will become mature, and you can see them maturing here, and on the right is a fully mature cone. Other species have cones that take on various morphologies. So here's a pine cone on the left, a very big one. It's about 1 foot long and very heavy. And on the right is a really interesting kind of cone. It looks almost like a berry. It looks almost like a little fruity structure. This is a cone of yew, Taxus. And you will remember that Taxus is the source of Taxol, the chemotherapy drug. But the yew has a cone that is fleshy. It's a cone that makes a single seed. So each one of those red berry-like structures is actually a cone that has a single seed in it. Here are some other conifers. Douglas fir, you might be familiar with, particularly if you're from the West. Houses have been made from this. It makes beautiful flooring, beautiful timbers, a very, very big, strong conifer. The larch, you know, is deciduous. It's common here in this part of the world. It's common in swamps. It's common in wet and poor soils. The sequoia is one of the world's largest trees. Bristlecone pine is one of the world's oldest individual trees. That is to say, a tree that's not a clone. It's one of the oldest, and individuals have been found that are more than 4,000 years old. Wollemi pine, which was known in the fossil record and then recently discovered, and juniper. Juniper is the source of gin. Those juniper cones that are blue, if you ever see them or find them, you can crush them and smell them. It smells exactly like gin because that's the flavor of gin. Conifers have a very slow reproduction. You know that it's slow because of this diagram from your textbook. You can see that pollination occurs well before fertilization. So here's an example from jackpine. This is a picture I took here on the Bluff Trail outside of Halifax, which is a trail that I was involved in constructing for a wilderness area. And it's called the Bluff Wilderness Hiking Trail. And there are moose and bear and coyote and bobcat and otter and mink just 20 minutes outside of Halifax. 25 or 30 kilometers of hiking trails. So here's the jackpine, and you can see here there are some male cones, and development of these male cones started a year ago. And this year, that is in their second year, they're going to pollinate female cones that also started at the same time a year ago. Here's a female cone. This is not this year's female cone, but it was one that started 2 years ago, and it was pollinated a year ago. And the meiosis occurred then after the pollination. And this is going to mature, this female cone will, into a woody cone this year, and it will make mature seeds. So another way to keep track of all this slow reproduction is to say in the summer of year 1, male and female cones were initiated. Summer of year 2, male meiosis occurred, making pollen. Pollination occurred. Female meiosis then occurred after pollination. And then the male cones wither, they perish, they are shed from the plant until their new ones are made. And then in summer of year 3, fertilization occurs in those female cones where the pollen had been sitting there at the micropyle. And these then mature into seeds in the late summer and fall of the 3rd year. So this is a very slow reproductive process. So conifers have slow reproduction. The next great invention in land plants is the flower. The flower gave rise to the flowering plants. The flowering plants, unlike conifers, have many different kinds of pollen vectors. They have hummingbirds, they have bats, they have bees, they have moths. Some of them even have wind. They also have, unlike conifers, fast reproduction. It's only days, weeks, or months from pollination to fertilization and seed maturation. So unlike conifers, it doesn't take years. They do things much more quickly. They also have many, many more species. We'll talk about flowering plants next time. See you then.